The morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of Harold Matthews' bedroom window, just as it had done for the past 50 years. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the old alarm clock rang with its familiar buzz, and Harold's weathered hand reached out to silence it. At 93 years old, he didn't really need an alarm anymore. His body was used to waking up early, a habit from his military days that never left him. Harold lived alone in his small white house on Cedar Street, the same house where he had raised his children and loved his wife, Martha, until she passed away 5 years ago. The house wasn't fancy, but it was home. Pictures of his family covered the walls, and his military medals hung proudly in a display case near the front door. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine. He would carefully make his bed with hospital corners, just like he learned in the army. His movements were slow but precise. The wooden cane leaning against his bedside table was his constant companion now, though he sometimes looked at it with a hint of stubbornness in his bright blue eyes. In the bathroom, Harold took his time getting ready. His hand shook slightly as he shaved, but he never missed a spot. He put on his best casual clothes, always ironed, always clean. Today, it was his favorite light blue button-down shirt and dark gray pants. Around his neck, he wore his dog tags from World War II. He never took them off. They were as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. The kitchen was Harold's next stop. He turned on his old radio to listen to the morning news while making a cup of black coffee. The coffee maker was a gift from his daughter Sarah, who worried about him living alone. Harold smiled at the thought of her concern. She called him every evening to check on him, and though he appreciated her love, he was determined to stay independent. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Harold put on his brown leather jacket, carefully checked his wallet and house keys, and picked up his cane. The walk to Joe's diner was his favorite part of the day. It wasn't just about breakfast. It was his way of proving to himself and everyone else that he could still take care of himself. Joe's diner was exactly 4 blocks away. Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every tree, and every house along the way. Mrs. Anderson, who lived 2 houses down, always waved to him from her garden. The Thompson kids would shout, "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," as they waited for their school bus. Harold would wave back, remembering when his own children were that young. The walk usually took him 20 minutes, though it would take others just 5. But Harold didn't mind. Each step was deliberate, each movement careful. His cane tapped a steady rhythm on the concrete as he walked. Sometimes his knee would ache from an old war injury, but he never complained. Pain was an old friend by now. People in the neighborhood respected Harold. They knew him as the friendly veteran who always had time for a kind word or a story. The younger folks especially liked hearing about his time as a soldier in World War II, though he was careful about which stories he shared. Some memories were better left in the past. At Joe's diner, Harold had his own special seat, the third booth from the door. Joe's father had given him that spot decades ago, and Joe kept the tradition alive. The vinyl seats were cracked and worn, but to Harold, they were more comfortable than any fancy restaurant's chairs. The waitress, Jenny, would have his usual order ready before he even sat down: 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon, wheat toast, and a fresh cup of coffee. She called him Sir, and always made sure his coffee cup stayed full. Harold would take his time with breakfast, reading the morning paper and exchanging greetings with other regular customers. This was Harold's life, simple, orderly, and dignified. He had fought for his country, raised a family, and earned the right to live life at his own pace. Little did he know that his peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his patience, courage, and wisdom in ways he never imagined. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Harold was getting ready for his daily walk to Joe's diner when he heard it, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines, louder than anything Cedar Street had heard before. He walked to his front window and pulled back the curtain, his free hand gripping his cane a little tighter. 5 motorcycles were parked in front of the old Wilson hardware store across from Joe's diner. The store had been empty for months after Mr. Wilson retired, but now there was a new sign being hung up: Steel Hornets NC Clubhouse. The letters were bold and black, with a fierce-looking hornet painted beside them. Harold watched as more motorcycles arrived. The riders were mostly young men in their 20s and 30s, wearing black leather jackets with yellow patches on the back. They were carrying boxes and furniture into the old store, laughing and shouting to each other. Their voices carried across the street. filled with rough words that made Harold shake his head in disapproval. For the first time in years, Harold hesitated before starting his morning walk. He stood at his front door, watching the bikers through the screen. Mrs. Anderson came out to get her morning paper and quickly went back inside when one of the bikers whistled at her. The Thompson kids' mother hurried them into the car instead of letting them wait for the bus at their usual spot. Finally, Harold took a deep breath and stepped outside. The morning air was cool, but his palms were sweaty on his cane. As he walked past the clubhouse, the noise got louder. Music blasted from inside the building, and the smell of cigarette smoke filled the air. Some of the bikers stopped what they were doing to stare at him. "Hey, look at this," one of them called out. "It's like watching a turtle cross the road." Several others laughed, and Harold felt his cheeks grow warm. He kept walking, his back straight and his eyes forward, just like he'd learned in the army. When Harold reached Joe's diner, things were different inside too. The usual morning customers were sitting far from the windows, speaking in whispers. Jenny, the waitress, looked worried as she served coffee. Joe himself stood behind the counter, his arms crossed, watching the activity across the street through the diner's big front window. "Can you believe this, Harold?" Joe asked as Harold sat in his usual booth. "They bought the whole building yesterday. The realtor didn't even tell anyone what kind of business was moving in." Harold looked around at the worried faces of his neighbors. Mr. Chen from the grocery store was shaking his head. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, was gathering her things to leave early. The peaceful morning routine that everyone loved was changing before their eyes. Throughout breakfast, the noise from across the street got louder as more motorcycles arrived. Harold counted 15 bikes by the time he finished his eggs. The sidewalk was now crowded with leather-clad figures, some of them drinking from bottles even though it wasn't even 9 o'clock in the morning. On his walk home, Harold had to squeeze past 3 motorcycles that were parked blocking part of the sidewalk. His cane caught on a bike's foot peg, and he almost fell. The group of bikers standing nearby laughed, and one of them mimicked his walking style, hunched over and pretending to use a cane. That afternoon, Harold sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the street he'd lived on for 50 years transform. The quiet neighborhood sounds were now drowned out by revving engines and loud music. He saw some of his neighbors driving past the clubhouse instead of walking, trying to avoid the crowd of bikers that grew larger as the day went on. When Sarah called that evening for their daily chat, Harold didn't mention the new neighbors. He didn't want her to worry, but as he lay in bed that night, listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles and occasional shouts from the clubhouse, he wondered how much more would change. The peaceful life he had known on Cedar Street seemed to be disappearing, and for the first time in many years, Harold felt uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. As days turned into weeks, Harold watched his beloved Cedar Street change more and more. The Steel Hornets Motorcycle Club grew bigger, with new members joining almost every day. The small parking area in front of the clubhouse couldn't hold all their motorcycles anymore, so they started parking along both sides of the street. Every morning, Harold faced the same difficult choice. Should he stay home or walk to Joe's diner? His daughter Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "Dad, you should let me drive you to breakfast," she had said during one of their evening calls, but Harold refused. At 93 years old, his morning walk was one of the few things that made him feel like himself. The trouble usually started when he passed the clubhouse. A group of younger bikers would gather near the entrance, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. At first, they just watched him walk by, but soon they started making comments. "Look who it is, the slowest man on earth," one of them, a tall man with a red bandana, would say. "Hey Gramps, need a motor for that cane," another would joke, revving his motorcycle engine. Harold kept walking, head held high, just as he had done during tough times in the war. But each taunt stung more than he wanted to admit. These young men had no idea that he had once been as strong as they were, that he had fought for the freedom they now enjoyed. One morning, 3 new members of the Steel Hornets decided to make things worse. As Harold walked past, they started walking behind him, copying his slow steps and the way he used his cane. Some people passing by in cars slowed down to watch, and Harold could hear laughter. Left, right, left, right. One of the bikers called out in a mocking military voice, "Company, halt." Harold's hands shook on his cane, but not from age, from anger. He remembered commanding real soldiers during the war, brave men who had fought and died with honor. These young men were making fun of something they didn't understand. When he reached Joe's diner that morning, Jenny saw that something was wrong. She brought him his usual breakfast without asking and added an extra piece of bacon, her way of trying to cheer him up. Joe came over to his booth too, concern written on his face. "Harold, I've called the police about them 3 times now," Joe said, sitting across from him. "They say they can't do anything unless the bikers break the law. Making noise and being rude isn't illegal." Other regular customers at the diner started sharing their own stories. Mr. Chen's grocery store had lost customers because people were afraid to park near the clubhouse. Mrs. Peterson had to change the library's story time to the afternoon because mothers didn't want to bring their children in the morning when the bikers were most active. The worst part was seeing how the neighborhood children were affected. The Thompson kids no longer waited for their school bus on that corner. The youth baseball team stopped practicing in the small park nearby. The sound of children playing was replaced by revving engines and loud music. One Thursday morning, the confrontation reached a new level. As Harold walked past the clubhouse, one of the younger bikers started following him with a video camera. "This here's a nature documentary," the biker announced loudly to his friends. "Watch as the ancient turtle makes his slow journey across the concrete jungle." The others laughed and joined in, making exaggerated documentary-style comments about Harold's every move. Some pulled out their phones to record too. Harold could feel his face getting red, but he kept walking, each step careful and deliberate. Inside Joe's diner, Harold sat in his usual booth, but he couldn't focus on his breakfast. His hands trembled as he tried to hold his coffee cup. Jenny noticed and quickly brought him a straw, pretending she did this for everyone. Through the window, you could still see the bikers outside, laughing and watching their videos. That evening, as Harold sat in his quiet house, he thought about how things had changed. The peaceful neighborhood where he had lived for so long was becoming a place he didn't recognize. But as he looked at his old military photo on the wall, something stirred in his memory. Sometimes, he remembered, the biggest battles were won not with fists or weapons, but with courage and wisdom. He just hadn't figured out how to win this one yet. The morning that changed everything started with rain. Heavy drops fell from dark clouds, making soft tapping sounds on Harold's bedroom window. He looked outside at the wet streets and considered staying home. His arthritis always bothered him more in this weather, and his cane might slip on the wet sidewalk. But 50 years of routine wasn't easy to break. Harold put on his old rain jacket, the dark blue one he bought years ago when Sarah insisted he needed something waterproof. He tucked a small umbrella under his arm and gripped his cane firmly. The wood felt smooth and familiar in his hand, worn from years of use. The rain was falling harder when he stepped outside. Water dripped from the brim of his hat as he carefully made his way down his front steps. The sidewalk looked slippery, so he took extra care with each step. His knee ached with the dampness, but he pressed on. As he approached the Steel Hornets clubhouse, Harold could see fewer bikes than usual. Most bikers didn't ride in the rain, but a handful of them were huddled under the clubhouse's awning, drinking coffee and watching him. The red bandana biker was there, along with the one who liked to make video recordings. "Hey look, the old-timer's water-resistant," one called out, making the others laugh. Harold kept walking, focusing on his steps. The sidewalk was especially slick near the clubhouse where oil from the motorcycles had mixed with the rain. He moved even more slowly, knowing a fall at his age could be dangerous. "Come on, Grandpa, my grandmother moves faster than that." Another biker shouted. More laughter followed. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Harold's cane hit a particularly slick spot on the concrete. He felt it slide forward, and suddenly his balance was gone. He tried to catch himself, but his arms windmilled uselessly in the air. The umbrella clattered to the ground as he fell. The impact wasn't as bad as it could have been. His military training from all those years ago had taught him how to fall, but still, he found himself sitting on the wet sidewalk, his pants soaking up the rain. His cane had skittered a few feet away. The laughter from the clubhouse awning grew louder. None of the bikers moved to help him. Instead, the one with the phone was recording again, narrating Harold's fall like it was a comedy show. And down goes the champ. Looks like someone forgot how legs work. Harold sat there in the rain, feeling every one of his 93 years. His hip hurt, and his hands were scraped from trying to catch himself, but what hurt most was the laughter. In all his years, through the war, through raising a family, through losing his wife, he had maintained his dignity. Now here he was, sitting in a puddle while young men laughed. But then something strange happened. As Harold sat there, looking up at the laughing bikers, he didn't feel angry. Instead, he remembered something from long ago. He remembered being 20 years old, standing with his army buddies, laughing at an old man who couldn't keep up during a town evacuation in France. He remembered how invincible he had felt then, how old age had seemed like something that happened to other people. And suddenly, Harold saw these young bikers differently. He saw past their leather jackets and tough attitudes. He saw young men who, like he had been once, couldn't imagine what it was like to be old. They couldn't understand the frustration of a body that no longer did what you wanted it to do, the indignity of needing help for things you once did easily. As the rain fell around him, soaking through his clothes, Harold made a decision. You wouldn't get angry. You wouldn't complain to the police again. You would do something these young men wouldn't expect, something that would either change everything or fail completely. Slowly, carefully, Harold pushed himself up from the wet sidewalk. One of the bikers actually took a step forward, as if to help, then stopped when his friends looked at him. Harold retrieved his cane and his umbrella, straightened his jacket, and turned to look directly at the group under the awning. What he would do next would surprise everyone, including himself. The next morning dawned bright and clear after the rain. Harold stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his collar with extra care. Today, he put on his best white shirt and his navy blue tie, the one he usually saved for special occasions. From his dresser drawer, he took out a small, worn leather wallet. Inside was something he hadn't shown anyone in years. As he walked toward the Steel Hornets clubhouse, neighbors watched from their windows. They had heard about his fall yesterday. Mrs. Anderson had even called Sarah, who had phoned Harold 3 times last night, begging him to let her drive him to breakfast from now on, but Harold had other plans. The motorcycles were back today, gleaming in the morning sun after the rain. Their owners stood in their usual spots, some drinking coffee, others working on their bikes. When they saw Harold approaching, the usual smirks and whispers started. But today, Harold didn't walk past the clubhouse. Instead, he stopped right in front of it. Using his cane for support, Harold climbed the 3 steps to the clubhouse door. The bikers watched in surprise as he gripped the heavy door handle and pulled it open. The inside of the clubhouse was dark compared to the bright morning light. Music played from speakers in the corners, and the smell of coffee and leather filled the air. Several heads turned to stare as Harold walked in. Some bikers stopped their pool game to watch. Behind the bar, a large man with a gray beard straightened up. This was Iron Mike Davidson, the club president, though Harold didn't know that yet. "Lost your way, old-timer?" Someone called out. A few people laughed, but the laughter died quickly when Harold walked straight to the bar, his cane tapping firmly on the wooden floor. Iron Mike watched as Harold carefully sat on one of the bar stools. The old veteran took out his wallet, and with slightly shaking hands, removed an old photograph. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, but the image was still clear. He placed it carefully on the bar. The photograph showed a young soldier, handsome in his uniform, sitting astride a massive military motorcycle. Behind him, bombed-out buildings lined a street somewhere in France. The young soldier was grinning at the camera, one hand on the motorcycle's handlebar, the other giving a thumbs up. "That's me in 1944, Harold said, his voice clear and strong. "That's my Harley-Davidson Duel. I rode her through France, carrying messages between Allied units, sometimes right through German-held territory." Iron Mike picked up the photograph, studying it carefully. Other bikers began gathering around, their faces curious. The young man who had recorded Harold's fall yesterday leaned in for a better look. "We called her Freedom Flyer," Harold continued, pointing to the motorcycle in the photo. "She could do 60 miles per hour on good roads. Saved my life more than once, outrunning German patrols. Lost her during the Battle of the Bulge, when an artillery shell landed too close. Nearly lost my leg too." His fingers touched his bad knee unconsciously as he spoke. The clubhouse had grown very quiet now, except for the soft music playing in the background. Even the pool players had come over to listen. "Had 3 more Harleys after the war," Harold said, reaching into his wallet again. He pulled out another photo, this one from the 1950s, showing him with his family next to a gleaming motorcycle. "Rode until my eyes started going bad about 15 years ago. Doctor said I had to stop." Iron Mike handed the war photo to one of his members, and it began making its way around the room. Harold could hear the whispers. Check out the bike. That's a real WLA. Those were rare. He was a dispatch rider. Why are you telling us this? Iron Mike asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Harold looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the younger bikers who had mocked him. Because I thought you should know that I understand the freedom you feel on those bikes out there. I felt it too. And because sometimes it's easy to forget that old men weren't always old. The silence that followed was different from any silence the clubhouse had heard before. It was a silence full of respect, understanding, and maybe a little shame. Iron Mike leaned forward on the bar, his large hands wrapped around a coffee mug. The morning sun now streamed through the clubhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Harold's photographs lay between them on the bar, pieces of history on worn paper. 20 years Marine Corps, Iron Mike said quietly, reaching into his own vest pocket. He pulled out a small metallic object, a combat service pin. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan. Different war, different bike, same brotherhood. The younger bikers gathered closer, their earlier mockery forgotten. The one with the red bandana, whose name was Tommy, pulled up a bar stool next to Harold. His eyes kept moving between the young soldier in the photograph and the old man sitting at the bar. How fast did you have to ride, carrying those messages? Tommy asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The phone he had used to record Harold's fall was nowhere in sight now. Harold's eyes lit up at the question, sometimes as fast as the bike could go. The Germans would hear the engine and start shooting. You had to zigzag to dodge bullets while keeping the message bag safe. He gestured with his hands, showing the motion. Lost 2 buddies doing that job. Good riders, both of them. The club members listened intently as Harold described riding through war-torn France. He told them about the time he had to deliver urgent orders during a thunderstorm, about hiding his bike in a barn while German patrols passed by, and about the French families who would help him with fuel when his tank ran low. The worst part wasn't the enemy, Harold explained, his voice growing softer. It was the roads. Bomb craters everywhere. Had to learn to read the ground while going full speed. One wrong move, and he shook his head, remembering. Iron Mike nodded in understanding. Afghanistan was like that too. IEDs instead of bomb craters, but same idea. You learn to read the ground or you don't come back. Some of the younger bikers started sharing their own stories, not of war, but of close calls on the road, of learning to handle their machines in dangerous situations. Harold listened carefully, offering occasional comments about motorcycle handling that showed he still remembered every lesson from his riding days. Your technique for taking curbs, he told Tommy, reminds me of how we had to handle those old WLAs. The weight distribution was similar to what you're describing. As the morning went on, more club members arrived. Each one was quickly pulled into the gathering around Harold, shown the photographs, and told who he was. The respect in their eyes grew as they realized this wasn't just any old man. This was someone who had ridden motorcycles in conditions they could barely imagine. Jenny from the diner appeared at the clubhouse door, looking worried when she didn't see Harold in his usual booth. She stopped in surprise at the scene before her. Harold at the center of a group of bikers, all of them leaning in to hear his words. Bring breakfast over here, Jenny, Iron Mike called out. Harold's eating with us today. Harold's usual breakfast arrived at the bar. 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon, wheat toast. But this time, he was surrounded by new friends instead of sitting alone in his booth. The bikers kept asking questions between bites, eager to hear more about his experiences. You know, Iron Mike said thoughtfully, looking at the old photograph again, we've got a few members who restore vintage bikes, including military ones. He glanced at Harold. Would you be interested in seeing their work? Maybe give them some pointers about how these machines were really used back then. Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the excitement of having knowledge that others valued, of being seen as more than just an old man with a cane. He looked around at the faces watching him expectantly, saw the genuine interest in their eyes. I'd like that very much, he said, smiling. Those old bikes, they each had their own personality, their own stories. He patted his cane gently. Kind of like old soldiers. The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive. Nothing like the mocking sounds that had followed him down the street just yesterday. Something had changed in that clubhouse, something important. It wasn't just about motorcycles anymore. It was about understanding, respect, and the bridges that could be built between generations when people took the time to really see each other. The changes on Cedar Street happened slowly at first, then all at once. In the weeks that followed Harold's visit to the clubhouse, the neighborhood watched in amazement as the relationship between the old veteran and the Steel Hornets transformed completely. It started with Harold's morning walk. The next day after his visit, Tommy, the biker who had once mocked him with a phone camera, was waiting outside the clubhouse. When he saw Harold approaching, he quickly walked over. "Morning, sir," Tommy said, falling into step beside Harold. "Mind if I walk with you to the diner?" Harold noticed that Tommy had slowed his pace to match his own. There was no impatience, no jokes about his speed. When they reached a slightly uneven part of the sidewalk, Tommy naturally moved to Harold's side, ready to help if needed. At the diner, other bikers were already there, having cleaned up their usual mess of motorcycles to clear the path. They had pushed 2 tables together, and Iron Mike stood up when Harold entered. "Your booth or our table, Harold?" Iron Mike asked. "Choice is yours." Harold looked at his familiar booth, then at the group of bikers waiting expectantly. "I think I'll try something new today," he said, walking toward their tables. The changes spread beyond breakfast time. The younger club members started taking turns checking on Harold throughout the day. They would bring him groceries, fix things around his house, or just sit on his porch to hear more stories about his motorcycling days. Sarah noticed the difference during her evening calls. "Dad, you sound different," she said. "Happier." "I've made some new friends," Harold told her. "They're helping me remember what it was like to be young." The biggest surprise came when Bobby, one of the club's mechanics, discovered a rusted 1942 Harley-Davidson Bullied in a barn outside town. The bike was in terrible shape, but Bobby had a vision. He and several other members spent their free time restoring it, constantly asking Harold for advice about original details. "The speedometer should be painted olive drab," Harold would tell them, or, "That's not quite right. The ammunition box mounted differently." His memory for these details amazed the younger men. The noise level on Cedar Street changed too. The bikers still rode their motorcycles, but they were more considerate about when and where they revved their engines. The loud music from the clubhouse stopped during early morning hours. Instead, the sound of laughter and friendly conversation could be heard as Harold shared more stories of his riding days. Mrs. Anderson started tending her garden again. The Thompson kids returned to their usual bus stop, now under the watchful eyes of bikers who made sure no cars drove too fast past them. Mr. Chen's grocery store got new customers. Hungry bikers who always paid in full and helped elderly shoppers carry their bags. One sunny morning, Bobby walked into Joe's diner where Harold was having breakfast with several club members. Bobby's face was covered in grease and his eyes were bright with excitement. "It's ready," he announced. "Harold, would you like to come see it?" The group walked Harold to the clubhouse's garage. There, gleaming in the sunlight, stood the restored Bullied. Every detail was perfect, from the olive drab paint to the military markings. It looked exactly like Freedom Flyer, the bike Harold had ridden in France. "We thought," Iron Mike said, putting a hand on Harold's shoulder, "that it could stay here in the clubhouse, as a reminder of where we all come from, maybe inspire some of the younger riders to learn their history." Harold walked slowly around the motorcycle, his cane tapping softly on the concrete floor. He reached out to touch the handlebar, feeling the same grip pattern he had known so well all those years ago. His eyes grew misty, but his smile was bright. "You know what this bike represents?" he asked the gathered bikers. "It's not just about war or military service. It's about brotherhood. About looking out for each other, no matter what." He looked around at the faces watching him, faces that now showed respect instead of mockery, friendship instead of contempt. That's what riding has always been about. The transformation was complete. The Steel Hornets were no longer just a motorcycle club. They had become guardians of history, protectors of their neighborhood, and most importantly, a new family for an old rider who had found his way back to the brotherhood of the road. By the end of summer, Cedar Street had become a very different place from what it had been in spring. The Steel Hornets clubhouse, once viewed as a neighborhood problem, had transformed into a community center of sorts. The change was most visible on Sunday mornings, when bikes of all kinds lined the street in front of Joe's diner. It had started with a simple suggestion from Tommy. "We should invite other veterans," he had said one morning. "There must be more riders from different wars who have stories to share." The first veterans' breakfast brought in three older men who had ridden motorcycles in Vietnam. They sat with Harold at the longest table in Joe's diner, trading stories while younger bikers listened intently. The next week, a woman who had served as a motorcycle courier in Desert Storm joined them. Word spread quickly. Soon, veterans from all over the city were coming to Seder Street on Sunday mornings. Joe had to start opening his diner an hour earlier to accommodate everyone. The Steel Hornets cleared their parking area, making sure there was always space for older visitors who had trouble walking far. Harold's daughter Sarah couldn't believe her eyes when she finally came to visit. Instead of finding her father isolated and troubled, she saw him at the center of a vibrant community. He sat at his usual spot, but now he was surrounded by people of all ages, sharing stories and laughter. "Dad," she said, watching him point out details on the restored Bullied to a group of young riders, "you've created something amazing here." The Steel Hornets had changed too. Under Iron Mike's leadership, they started a mentorship program. Older veterans taught young riders about motorcycle maintenance and safe riding techniques. But more importantly, they shared their experiences, helping bridge the gap between generations. Tommy, who had once recorded Harold's struggles for laughs, now ran the club's social media. Instead of mocking videos, he posted stories about veteran riders and their experiences. His interviews with Harold about wartime motorcycle missions became popular online, drawing attention from motorcycle enthusiasts around the country. The restored Bullied in the clubhouse became famous in its own right. Motorcycle magazines wrote articles about it, praising the accurate restoration and the story behind it. But more important than the publicity was what the bike represented, a symbol of how respect and understanding could transform relationships. The neighborhood changed too. Mrs. Anderson started baking cookies for the Sunday gatherings. Mr. Chen provided sandwiches at cost for the bigger events. The Thompson kids, once scared of the bikers, now hung around the clubhouse after school, learning about motorcycle engines from Bobby while doing their homework. One cool autumn morning, as Harold walked to the diner without his cane, he now had plenty of steady hands nearby if he needed help. He saw something that made him stop and smile. A new sign hung under the Steel Hornets Club logo. It read, "Home of the Veterans Breakfast, all riders welcome." Inside the diner, the usual Sunday crowd was gathering. World War II veterans like Harold, Vietnam vets on their restored choppers, Desert Storm riders on modern bikes, and young veterans from recent conflicts, all sharing coffee and stories. The Steel Hornets moved among them, making sure everyone had what they needed. "You know what you did, don't you?" Iron Mike said, joining Harold at his table. "You didn't just change us, you showed us who we could be." Harold looked around the diner. At one table, Tommy was interviewing a Vietnam veteran about his experiences. At another, Bobby was showing Mrs. Anderson's grandson pictures of the WLA restoration project. Through the window, he could see bikers helping an elderly veteran park his motorcycle. "I didn't do anything special," Harold said. "I just helped everyone remember something important. Sometimes the best way to handle conflict isn't to fight back or give up. Sometimes you just need to help people see each other clearly." The legacy Harold created lived on long after that summer. The Veterans Breakfast became a city tradition, drawing riders from all over. The Steel Hornets became known for their community service and veteran support, and Cedar Street, once divided by fear and misunderstanding, became a place where the roar of motorcycles meant friendship, respect, and the understanding that every person, young or old, had a story worth hearing. Most importantly, Harold's story became a lesson passed down through the Steel Hornets Club. True strength isn't about power or intimidation. It's about the courage to build bridges when others would build walls.